Hello everyone, today we talk about the Carolingian peasant family. It's gonna be a short video, hopefully, in which we, introduce this actually very important but poorly documented topic. As you understand, we are in the 9th century, and we know relatively few about these early or high medieval societies at this point. And definitely even less about the lower strata of the population that still made up the majority, definitely, of the population at the time, the peasantry being obviously the overwhelming majority, numerically speaking, of society, an agrarian society, a pre-industrial system that naturally revolves around land exploitation. And in a particular situation in European history in which gradually the free peasantry is gradually losing its autonomy, its freedom properly, and that it never kind of fully enjoyed, because still even in pre-Carolingian times and the further stratification and aristocratization, hierarchization, let's put it better, of society, the various chieftains had gradually, brought these people under and obliged them, also, in a positive sense, not just with violence or coercion, but sometimes because it was the only option to basically depend on them, right? And as you know, and as we have explained a lot of times, there's a pretty hefty Carolingian Europe playlist at this point. The Carolingians will fundamentally intensify this hierarchization, right? They will create a society where just a few people own the majority of the land, right? That is the most important source of wealth, right? And in this process, the rest of the population fundamentally, obviously, works on this land, but becomes fundamentally attached to it, right? Or at least it grows in ever more so, right? This is a process that began in very early in time, right? Usually this order is, historiographically remembered since the time of Diocletian and Constantine, with, the progressive, the legal imposition to remain in a certain land plot, to perform that same specific role over the generations, to become tied to authority, whichever it was locally. Also monetary change, economical changes in general were bringing through peasantry in general to search for seek protection under certain landlords, right? And this is a process that has continued, has increased all over Europe. Aside from the Roman Empire, even those lands that hadn't seen even Roman domination, that remained under Germanic rule. So this process, right? Areas like Germany. Just yesterday we were talking about the Carolingian conquest of Saxony. Well, these were fundamentally less stratified societies than especially the ones of northern France. That point where this broader Frankish system, Vassalatic-Beneficiary system, was spread all over the rest of the Carolingian Empire. But even in there, over the centuries, the aristocracies had gained weight, importance, and they were, by the way, imitating exactly the models that were spread by the greatest power around, was the first Merovingian and the Carolingian Empire, and that were definitely very, very advantageous for all those who especially even wanted to rise from over the freemen that up to that point had checked the emergence of monarchs, of princes, right? This is what also differentiates the areas formerly dominated by the Roman Empire and the ones who weren't, because the Romans had fundamentally expanded and taken root as a political and social system, including land exploitation, the latifundium, etc., in areas that could support it, right? Beyond the the ancient Roman frontier, there were simply not enough resources to centralize. So societies were freer, but also poorer, right? So we don't, even in here, this is a point I always make, that is, we don't, I mean, more freedom in absolute terms, right? Not even considering the difference between negative or positive freedom, is not necessarily overlapping with, actual better living conditions, right? The tribal freemen weren't having, necessarily better than, I don't know, the Frankish peasantry in Gaul, right? And the same goes, but at many other levels of society, right? Less hierarchization means also less central authority, more difficulty to make justice, because judicial duels are not the best systems to enforce justice as as it should be, and in general, this transformation that is naturally seen even through its oppression, its abuses, its definitely despotic, tyrannic, if you want, model imposed in many areas. Yesterday, once again, we're remembering the Carolingian conquest of Saxony, and we've seen how many times the Saxons rebelled because they absolutely they didn't want this to happen, right? But it was still an oligarchic society, fighting against a much greater oligarchic society that won because, in fact, was more hierarchical, was more organized, it had more resources under it, could mobilitate more resources in this sense. And this means what that the world building, actually, of more advanced societies is definitely of the Carolingian Empire was really well structured, and it functioned, right? And it could have not been a Carolingian Empire without the system that in many ways was predatory, right? Was exploiting intensively and mercilessly the resources available, right? But at the same time left, a mark with a structure on the base of which, in post-Carolingian times, what we know as seigneurial Europe developed into, those broader systems that we know in the High Middle Ages that overall were, better civil systems, right? Even starting from this terribly, privatistic character of the Carolingian world that failed to centralize, and that is one of the reasons. Probably would have not had the means to do it anyway, but that made an effort in that sense, even to restore a certain order and centrality of public authority, and in fact survived the Carolingian Empire, right? The empire went on, right? And this was to remain up to the contemporary era as such, because public authority didn't vanish, left a mark on the basis of which a greater order could be enforced, right? And I stress the word enforced too, because as we were saying before, this was done even violently, right? And very often not leaving people a choice, right? But we often forget that this was not just a matter of, the guy at the top who enforced the choice. It was also the people at the bottom that realized that aside from this kind of centralizing push, under the command of a single lord, the dependency on it, let's say better, from saying centralizing in a kind of statal sense, because once again it's private, was dictated, was seen as, given the set of circumstances that surrounded both of the actors here, as one of the most convenient things to do, right? And it's hard for us to believe this, even though actually in the last, I think, 20 years or so, actually in the same Western world, we're seeing largely similar phenomena of this guy. I mean, people will accept a condition of dependency on a certain, employer that is not, definitely gifting you with anything, but, if anything, is giving you the possibility at least to earn something. And even if the conditions are not that great, still do it because you need that, right? And this is a thing in history that usually happens also in times of crisis, right? And it's not a surprise, in fact, that this increased privatization, especially the seigneurial character, the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system, increased at the moment of the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire itself, that had attempted at least to to maintain the beneficia in the hands of nominally, at least in the hands of the king, right? Even if the eventually, as soon as they were given as such, they were lost to those who had been provided them with. So in this process, we have what is a pretty homogeneous tendency, right? The all over Europe, all over Carolingian Europe and beyond, because as we were saying before, also other neighboring countries start adopting these systems, right? Anglo-Saxon society grows more privatistic over time. The Western Slavic society does. Even northern Iberia is affected by this. Denmark is affected by this. I mean, it was a model of government that overall this would require maybe a broader socio-economical explanation, also considering the fact that if there is a weak central authority, people tend to start expanding on their own, right? So if you let societies in this sense without a further increased control of the centralistic structures on what is happening out there, well, this is what will happen, and it's happening still today. Right, just banally, think about how much we depend from the internet and how the internet is still not very much legally disciplined as such. So there are dynamics, economical dynamics, that even start from there that are transnational, for example. They become a problem of jurisdiction, and we still can't fix. Also because practically speaking, there's not much of a way. Sometimes there is not the technology to do it. Right, so this is a time in which indeed the broader base of power is normally privatistic, and when it's more centralized, usually it's in areas that are, this depends also on the land, on the wealth distribution. See, also land distribution in this case, it equates. For example, when the Carolingians conquered the Lombard kingdom, well, they were a pretty well-functioning one. It was surely more, centralized and dramatically more civilly advanced and legally regulated. It was more literate. People had a higher per capita wealth, etc. But it was crushed anyway by the strength of the Carolingian Empire. It was it was huge in comparison, just banally in terms of space and population. We'll see how the things here, also in the land exploitation system exported by the Carolingians, is crucial in the process. And it was, even in this case, heading towards a greater privatization, because not all the abuses could be punished, or not all the also the clienteles were often more an effective mean than the centralistic one sometimes to rule itself. I mean, ask the Carolingians in that sense, that however needed to develop specifically a military system to keep all this together, to basically keep fueling the purpose to stick together in a society without a centralistic policy, right? So this has a great importance, and we have discussed the other day. We made also a video about post-Carolingian times in Catalonia and in Lombardy. There were two areas that were in fact being brought under Carolingian rule by force, and that where feudalism was exported, right, as a system, because it was non-existent, as at least in the Frankish, feudalism, let's say better, Vassalatic-Beneficiary system, that didn't exist as in the Frankish form, so intensely developed, right? And you can easily see there how this system was able to give a boost. At least this is debatable, actually, because there is a debate on this issue, right? What is that really? Did this system, as Europe on the whole was growing, just because guess what? Aside from whichever reason can be done, that it's not even demonstrable. Like I don't know, there was a climate warming. It's possible. It seems to be so, but it could easily be that, guess what? Humans have stuff around, and they gradually come to dominate it and to find new systems of expanding their control on it by default. So after the great demographic contraction of the the early Middle Ages, Europeans began to to grow once again and to re-expand. So we can't really tell whether it was actually the seigneurial system as such emerging from the the ashes of the Carolingian Empire that really gave that boost. But it surely veiculated, however, in a way that appears to be very well orderly compared to other societies that were kind of freer in a way, but that weren't able to accomplish the same political and social goals and infrastructural achievements and other feats than others that in fact were feudal, like the Carolingian one. It was an exception also because it was as big as it was. However, in Europe it was the only system that worked in that way. And today we talk about peasant family, and more specifically the few we can know about it. And we have to understand here that the actual base of the land power, right, was not the property of the land itself, right, but the control of the local communities and also of the instruments, right, of the working tools. This is what to be writes, and it is definitely true, right? There is a problem in all of these also if you look at political military history of conquering lands, but without doing definitely the greatest damage as possible. You can't just arrive in a place and exterminating everyone and say, okay, we got this new land, now it's ours. Who's gonna work the land? Who's gonna produce? So the Carolingian world definitely employed many systems that were including deportations, for example, or colonization, significantly many areas. But the point though was mainly to frame the local communities under the control of the authority, and also the means of production, right? Of course, the various this land belonged nominally to the king or to the authority, right? And the authority, as we've seen, enforced certain even free performances, free work, like the corvée, for example, for increasing his own private wealth, building mills, painting ovens, furnaces, and also building the roads, bridges, very importantly at this time, that from one side definitely show the asymmetry in the strength relation here between the lord and the peasantry, but at the same time should be realized that it was a system that was still operating with a constant reinvestment of the resources exacted, right? So all this free work was taken, yes, in this, even with force by, the Lord and his retinues, etc., because it was, as a deterrent force, right? Also, the Lord cared a lot, actually, about the people who lived in his land, exactly because of what we said, that they had to produce for him. But effectively, all this wealth was not treasured, if not maybe, in supplies, stocks for, times of famine or war, incursions, etc. But they were constantly reinvested on the territory, at the benefit of the community. A community that was, yes, increasingly depending from a private authority, but that was somewhat grown in his own way, right? So, this, I think we can't escape the broader international picture. I mean, in the sense that there were areas in the Carolingian Empire that, as we've said, were dramatically more socially stratified than others since centuries. I mean, Gaul had already been like this since centuries. Basically since Roman times, right? The Franks found still and basically seized, even if reduced, but still intact, the Roman latifundium system. Correct. Hence the great, even how the military reforms of Carolingian times were possible. There was already a base of, semi-professional troops with, amount of land that could work for their, for their training. The system was intensified. Land was confiscated by the church from the church, with church read, bishops that lived exactly like lay princes, like, with military retinues and whatever, land that had been nominally a royal possession since the time of Clovis, and definitely a system that had been fueling also this military aristocratic society in an expansive sense. I mean, indeed, Gaul, Francia in general, grew through the Carolingian times. Like the idea of the Carolingian Renaissance from an economical point of view is a myth that has been debunked. Right? This doesn't seem to have been an actually, an improvement of the living conditions in Carolingian Europe, right? It possibly things got even worse, especially considering how the Carolingian times ended, like with constant civil war that eventually led also to the incursions and this collapse of the political and social fabric that had at least kept the imperial power together as such, right? But indeed, this society had grown functionalized to that, kind of vassalatic military character that we knew in the seigneurial era, and that will be at the base of the feudal system to expand. That is to say that the local communities had been molded, been shaped in a way that could essentially contribute to this relatively available amount of troops that could be used to wage war on the neighbors and to expand the power further, right? So on a smaller scale, what the Carolingian Empire had done with the rest of Europe, right? There would be a lot to say in here, meaning that, of course, the various political and military events, the Carolingian Empire, as we were saying, were dramatic. The same conquest of certain powers was marked by an immediate gain from the empire in terms of loot, etc. But the systems got weakened in the process, right? And even those systems that worked fairly well on their own were transmuted in this vassalatic instability at some point. And this is all a broader issue that we can't reduce to the socio-economical system that was imported by the Carolingians, right? We mostly want to stress here that what happened in post-Carolingian times is and the formula that had been given to Europe during Frankish domination had fundamentally provided the means to re-expand, right, on a functional base, on actually an effective base. This system didn't implode in itself, right? It kept growing as far as we know, right? Even the 10th century, that is remembered as the Iron Century, the century of the Saxon invasions, right, of the Normans, of the Saracens, of the Magyars, and so on, actually was overall a century of growth, right? And guess why? Because even this system internally was capable of keeping its own growth in spite of all the blows it suffered from the outside and from the inside, because the post-Carolingian nobility in Europe kept naturally fighting principally against each other, right? The outside incursions were important, but I think the proportion, there is no comparison with the local the local fights, and the same goes for all those phenomena that developed in parallel, for example in Castellation, and this broader capacity of the vassalatic elite to essentially to think of the construction of a territorialized seigneury, right? The idea that in this pulverized world after, let's say, or at least besides public authority that was about to vanish, or what eventually remained intact, but also transformed itself in a more private character, more privatistically, let's say. In the end, this system was capable of creating an order from the bottom of the society, and paradoxically, it is this gluing factor of the vassalatic and later feudal system that is often overlooked, also from a political point of view. these were systems that were difficult to kind of penetrate from the same central authorities within the same territories. You can imagine even from the outside. So actually Europe didn't, I mean, what we know as high medieval, low medieval Europe expanded from this system, and it was an overwhelming force on its own, right? As, here we're going far from today's topic, but I think it's important to stress here how we don't have just to, let's say, stereotypically portray the process of framing peasant families under a specific land exploitation system just as a negative thing, right? Because as far as we're concerned, we know that these communities, even the word freemen, right? Because they were freemen technically, that remained so, even under the seigneurial system, right? Sometimes had it worse even than the serfs. The serfs sometimes were pretty successful people. And would become the next lords in some generation, in many cases. But had, as we were saying before, not much of a chance, not much of an option, right, to do otherwise. In perspective, this must be understood as in many other periods in history where, that things kind of go bad, but sometimes, it seems like human societies are fundamentally made to stick together and to find a functional solution anyway, because when you're confronted with real problems, with external threats, etc., you have to always considering though that this is not an homogeneous process, that there was a continuous infight between even the peasant communities, for example, and the local lords, sometimes in alliance with the kings, right? Sometimes kings and peasantry were much closer, or king and cities, etc., than king and nobility, right? And this is particularly interesting. We made some videos on Western Francia, for example, during the Viking invasions, and how this affected sometimes even how the Viking invasions even saved, in a sense, the Western Frankish monarchy, because in face of the threat posed by the Northmen incursions, the communities didn't simply go on their own in a centrifugal sense, but kind of said, okay, let's keep the monarchy here, even if it's largely ineffective outside of the Ile-de-France, because that can do something after all. And there are many aspects in this sense. Other countries had different histories, right? In Germany, for example, this passage was felt less, right, because there were less resources. Also, the local lords didn't have much to exact, and as a consequence, the free peasantry was stronger, right? We see it even from the composition of the armies. That cavalry had a lesser development at the outskirts of the Frankish world, and especially in Germany. There are other factors like urbanizations to take into account, but anyhow, another major important factor in this regard, as we were saying before, is also keeping your peasantry quite there, right? You don't exploit them, you don't make them work to death. You must know how productive they can be, right? Every person who cares about his own workers, about his own profit, knows that workers cannot be squeezed and think that that will be economically advantageous, because workers, to be good and to function well, they must have what they need, right? And that's what we often forget also about the concept of serfdom that develops in these times, that, as we were saying before, serfs sometimes were even more important for their masters than the free peasantry in that regard, because they were fully integrated within a system that gave them much more security and bonds and connections, even with the same seigneurial family, than what the free peasantry had. So everything was carefully balanced, and it was much more homogeneous all over Europe than we can imagine. Right, aside from the regional differences, this is how pre-industrial systems have always been working, or in the same exact way. Right, this was a mob. Just imagine Europe ruled by a huge, giant, territorialized, locally pulverized, but still pretty rooted mob. This is exactly the mob, right? There is no way to consider, these exactions, etc., from, to distinguish them from hush money. And the same attitudes, this privatistic mentality, the idea of the family, of the honor, of the vendetta, it's exactly the same, right? Of the mob. This is the world in pre-modern times, right? Before the central authority of the state appeared, the world has been ruled by the mob. And you can imagine the non, so positive aspect of this all, but it was still the only functional one, given that amount of resources and that political and social preconditions, right? And as we've seen, also the system, as imperfect as it was managed to from a moral point of view, let's put it in this way, because it was actually very, very functional and very logical. Very iron, logical. We often, I actually tend, to have the impulse to throw away all those books that when talk about times like these, or seigneurial times, or feudal times, tend to say, this was a seigneurial anarchy, right? The idea that there was chaos, right? When you find those statements, you can be pretty sure that person, for example, has never studied thoroughly I would say, if anything, just the military dimension of the story, right? And but also the socio-economical one probably would help a lot. If you judge just by political institutional standards, that is to say, oh look, these guys didn't have the state in the Middle Ages, haha, they sucked. I would have liked to see this person thrown in those times and see if it could have done any better. No, we would have seen it rotting in some ditch after a couple of days, because this was objectively the most functional system out there, and over these seigneuries here had a crystalline clear vision of what they needed to do. Also because very often that was the only thing they could do, like these patrimonial strategies, the creation of the expansion also of the the workable land, reclamation, deforestation, foundation of monasteries, creating this nets among the other, together with the other seigneurial families, etc. These all aimed at growing a tighter grip on the territory, making it work. Aside from the fact that it could get out of hand because they're you can't control the system overall. It's so unstable. There's no way that this is going to be a deterministic thing. But it has an iron logic, right? Everything is so clear once you have the ability to, and the possibility, if you're lucky to study these sources, if there is any, to understand that how could you have done differently from this? I mean, what other system could you have invented in here? And you start realizing actually the greatness of figures that you wouldn't consider great because there's just counts in 9th to 10th century Europe at a provincial scale at best, and say who cares about them? We only cares about kings and emperors, and all this stuff. These people were actually great minds within their own limits. They knew perfectly what the situation was, and there was no when we get morally shocked about how this world worked. However demanded, however question yourself, instead of simply throwing the thing away by judging it from your moral standards of 1,000 years after, if there was any option in the first place, and if you personally with your own values had been thrown in that world, you would have had any option, or you could have been able to do any better, right? To make less people die, to defend the community, something like that. This is the question you should always pose yourself when you study these sources. And as we were saying before, the labor force was everything, right? It was not much important to have a lot of land, in terms of sheer land surface, but rather the amount of people that lived on it, and that also constituted, very importantly, the raw material for the army and for the base of fiscal imposition of any type, right? What does this mean? It means that, as we have just said, the hierarchy is not there just to harass people. It's there actually to protect people. It's there to defend the community. And this whole thing just works because there are people who can be drafted, let's say, and maybe anachronistically, but or that have to pay taxes for others to serve, right? And someone must also remain home to work the land. So in fact, it was a kind of a rota system for I don't know, 3 out of 3 family nuclei. Just one contributed to the military. Went to war. Actually, the others contributed for the military expenses, but kept during wartime kept working the land at home, not going to war, but just paying for the guy who had left, right? And this was also a way not to exhaust the first of all the demographic resources as such, but also most immediately also the economical one, right? They were all one in this sense, and this is in fact a moment in which everything is also more simple than it actually looks, in the sense that today we are confronted with a society that is changing in a dramatically fast way and hyper complicated way. In those times, things didn't change often, right? This was really how it had in terms of person memory, human memory, how it had always been, right? And nobody saw, it would have been silly to propose anything different, given that this was objectively the only way that, just think that there are a few essentials here. The fact that nobody had thought how to make a different thing. And to be functional, for it to be functional, right? So the population was the actually important thing, right? And as a consequence, this is what happens in the Carolingian time with the increase of control over the population, is that men start to be counted, literally, right? This broader social certification brings to the creation of apposite registers and documents that basically counted people, defines the family nucleus, because always, according to Dewey, because men are worth much more than land in itself, right? They are the fundamental resource of the patrimony. Right, this is particularly important. The mansus, for example, there was the basic measure of unit of land measure. There it was standard in the sense that everybody reasoned in months. Like in Carolingian and Post-Carolingian Europe, that's basically the same term. That there were others, but they were essentially all synonyms. And this was surely the most, the overwhelmingly used. And they varied, though, in size. Like the mansus is not much the superficial amount in itself. It's meant to represent that initially, but over time it becomes just in parallel, a unit that made people immediately equated to a number of families rather than a superficial extension. The mansi could be of various size as land plots, but the people that lived on it was really the thing that mattered, right? And this produced, aside from many other things, including even a true market of plots of land, right? Especially in the most dynamic and monetized economies of the Carolingian world. A true market of these lands, but in general, right? And this is truer, in fact, in the most economically developed areas of the Carolingian Empire that are essentially northern France and northern Italy, of a series of documents. We made a video on this, and I remember how it was named, right? But in these areas, monasteries, lords, the same emperor actually, were very careful at predisposing the writing of the so-called polyptychs, right? That is, essentially inventories of lands and colonists. And these polyptychs are very precious because they are basically the only source we have. Aside from archaeology, that naturally is very costly and very partial in many ways, but for understanding something about these peasant realities, about which historically speaking, most of the time, worldwide, we know dramatically less than any other social stratum, right? And being this, however, the most important in productive terms, this is really a pity, as you understand. So these documents are very, very precious. In their nature, the polyptychs are also unfortunately born with other aims, right, rather than a pure demographic census, right? They, for example, they not always register the female population, right, nor the single families one by one. So this naturally is a problem. You see, the problem of women is because naturally there were juridical differences between men and women. So here, considering who is the head of the family, who is that sometimes owns the same land, it could be nominal, very often a male. There were actually women that they were much more economically autonomous than we think. This is particularly true in Italy, in Lombard Italy. These, at least of enjoying as I don't know how to say it in English, but let's say the use of a land, right? And for by testamentary decision, for example, is very widespread, right? And this often happened in that area because, as we were saying before, there was a higher per capita wealth. It means that the land distribution was more even, and therefore, individual families were freer sometimes to do what they wanted. In northern France, instead, the thing was the completely the other way around. So there were lots of families who were underlord. This happened in Italy as well, but not as much as in northern France. It's really the hub, the cradle of the whole Frankish system as it develops, and where we find the best sources in this regard, exactly because society was more hierarchical in that regard. Also, we often, of course, don't have a complete list of all the families, so that maybe these families were listed just because, I don't know, there was a particular situation that had to be clarified or established because it was a newly acquired land that was not the one that the Lord already knew by heart, essentially, who lived on. So all the various, for not talking, of course, about the partiality of the sources as they came up down to us, right? So as a consequence, a very few certain data can be, observable from these sources. And they are primarily French sources, as we've said, and definitely questions are much more numerous than the answers, right? Which means that we can sometimes just guess what the whole system worked like. It seems, for example, that the nuclear family was dominant, right? So this sounds like, as we will see now, that probably there was an easier control of the individuals, like the idea that these were people that were not counted or acting as communities, but were single couples with children that were shifted, deported, reinstalled somewhere else, right, at the Lord's will, right? Also, in these lists we have actually a lot of males among the young non-married, right? And how do we explain this exactly, right? Does this mean that women, for example, were under-registered in these sources, and for which reason, right? As we were saying before, we don't really know. Or baby girls were killed, like unfortunately it happens still today in many societies, because they were less convenient for the family, and they were literally killed in the cradle. Something extremely common up to a very few centuries ago, actually, even in Europe or in the Western world. Or is it possible that women were married earlier than men, which is also, an eventuality. We know from the Malthusian cycles these things varied over time. We can't really tell it. So in certain cases, we have been lucky to derive essentially the number of children per family from 2.6 to 4. And this considered that families made children continuously, right? Child mortality was dramatically high. And this was the only way, to ensure that at least someone would survive. That they could take care, they could help in the work, they could take care of the land management and all this stuff. But unfortunately, for this datum, we don't know, for example, at which age women usually gave birth, right? At which time they were married, as we have seen before. And so we haven't been able even to connect, in fact, what's the rate between women in fertile age and children between 0 to 4 years old. And also in this case, the data are clearly altered by, first of all, because we do not know when women got married in Carolingian times among the peasantry, hence the majority of the population. Equally, we are puzzled by the remarkable percentage of couple without children that seem to be up to the 30%. So they could be either newly married couples or older couples, right? In the first case, we can hypothesize that precocious marriage or the abandonment of the fatherly house at the moment of the same, or the capacity of courtly economies to house the new couples, right? That is, there was this sort of parcelization of not just of the land, but of the same family ties, right? To distribute this nuclei eventually on the various land plots. So, as a consequence, these data evidence the predominance of a nuclear family, right? That, as we were saying before, doesn't look anything like, especially northern France, like a the result of a strong community that comes to deal with the Lord and still operates in a sort of communitary fashion, right? These are individual people that fundamentally the lords dispose of their own decision, right? Also, there is an interesting study that has been led on an Italian polyptych, the one of Farfa, is one of the most important monasteries, right? Consider that monasteries are landlords for real. Here, these are probably papal monasteries, or some of the richest, most powerful in Europe, and they had, of course, their own land with lots of people working for them. This is close to Rome, and this study has confirmed the prevalence of simple families. There are basically 72%. Families, the children of which remain united basically up to the death of their father, and transforming themselves in turn in sort of brotherhoods that were dissolved instead in the moment in turn in which these siblings had, let's say, adult children in turn, right? So this is the picture of a more compact community, though. It's something done in a context in which definitely there was perhaps a slightly less control on the broader communities as such, but still fundamentally framed within a system that was under the lordly direction. So in this examples, we can't really stop here. I don't think there is much to add about. We could definitely do it. We will make other videos on this stuff, but this is just to give an idea sometimes of the brutal lack of information that we have in general. Naturally, these are things that are, fairly studied. I don't know about the literature about this stuff, because I don't study it. But I presume it's one of those fields that is so diversified, and we will be observing this difference chiefly for the seigneurial development as such. I mean, we'll make a dedicated videos to see how in different communities, for example, I don't know, the local bishop, the local lord, found certain solutions with the peasantry. There is a video we made, which is actually pretty late. I think it's about the 12th century, on the case of Sahagún in Spain, that has actually few to do with that. But just an example of, of essentially a feudalized society, which there is a bit still of dialectic of between the peasants and the lords and the bishop. And it's quite fascinating, a much more conflictual situation. But for Carolingian times, for now, we expose just this this idea of the increasing control on the communities from the side of the lords. Right? These people really began to be led, directed, settled by their masters, right? With whom they began to have very strong ties of dependence, right? And once again, this was not much of an option most of the times, for better and for worse, right? And it was a mix of the two things. But if you're interested in this topic, I made a lot of videos about seigneurial Europe, Carolingian, post-Carolingian times. You go to medieval society playlists, you find plenty of this stuff. Anyhow, I think we can stop it here. For now, just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.